Session management. Sessions are this notion of maintaining a dialogue between communicating devices. So a client on communicating with a web server or something like that. Sessions, believe it or not, operate at more than just the session layer within the protocol stack. They operate at the application layer where you have HTTP sessions, web sessions trying to preserve state between the client and the server itself. You have sessions at the session layer. I know that's a far-fetched idea, but like session initiation protocol, SIP, works at the session layer. And then you also have sessions being maintained at the TCP layer, or with TCP at the transport layer. Stateless protocols like HTTP that, by stateless we mean that they don't preserve state. There's no continuing information beyond whatever gets sent and whatever is received. So in an HTTP transmission, there's data sent, data received, and after that, that's it. There's no preservation of any of that. It's just a one-time shot and done. So what you see is use of sessions to actually preserve that state. And sessions can be maintained through tokens, or you'll frequently see these implemented as session IDs, and they allow the web server to actually track and maintain information with individual clients. So if I'm user 1 communicating with the web server and I have a session ID, the web server will always know that whoever's using that session ID, that's user 1, and whatever information they've sent us before or whatever information we've sent them before, we can track all of that. So we maintain this state between communications. HTTP tokens, this is the primary way that you'll see of maintaining states. The server will generate a token or this session ID, send it to the client, and then the client continually uses that session ID such that the server can track who they are, what they've done, and it can maintain that state. And you'll usually see this implemented either as a URL parameter, so you'll have a long 32-character random string in the URL that's tied to your session ID. Could be more or more characters or less characters than 32. You can also have HTTP cookies, so individual files that get placed on your computer that track who you are and what your related session is. So just an example of this really quick. Start on the right here. Without a session token, every client would receive the same answer. So if client A asks for example.com, what they're actually going to get is example.com. If client B makes the same request, they're going to get the same data back. And so it's this, there's no notion of differentiation between clients. With session IDs, you actually have the availability, you have the ability to give different responses based on what that session ID is. So if client here is asking example.com, but they have a session ID of 9FA, the server can recognize the fact that that's client A and give them a personalized version of example.com. Client B, you'll see, has a different ID, 3F20. And so with that ID, the web server recognizes, oh, this is a different person. This is not A, this is client B. Okay, I will give them their copy of example.com with whatever information I preserved through the session. How do you secure these types of sessions? Well, a couple different ways of doing it, through authentication, session management, or access control. Authentication, this is when you log into a website, you've got a username and password. With that account, you've authenticated the website. Now you get your session ID. And so requiring some type of authentication mechanism ahead of time will make sure that you're communicating with a legitimate user, not somebody who is spoofing a legitimate user. Session management, you can do things with initiating, monitoring, closing, or managing the session such that attackers can't compromise the session, and even if they do, the session is only good for a certain period of time. So they've got a very small window of being able to use that session in an attack. And then you have access control, typical methods of making sure that sessions are only started by legitimate users connected to certain IP addresses or certain devices or something like that. And you can only allow specific locations or people to start sessions and therefore access or modify data accordingly. Session hijacking, this is used to be a very common attack. It's getting harder and harder to do this, especially on the major sites like Google or Facebook. But with session hijacking, what you're doing as an attacker is compromising a user's session and essentially becoming them, becoming that user with their accesses, with their privileges. There are two different kinds of session hijacking. With target attacks, I'm looking for Chris's account and Chris's account only. I want to target my session hijacking attack at him. Then there's generic. You're looking for anything and everything. I'm looking for any user that I can compromise their session with. And you see this in a lot of the proof of concept or research session hijacking efforts that are out there. With attacks, there are a couple different ways of doing session hijacking. You can do it through URL mangling, where you're actually looking for the session ID that's in the URL, compromising that or trying to brute force it and come up with a valid session. You can do cookie manipulation, where if the site is storing a cookie with your session ID on a particular user computer, you can compromise those cookies. You can try to brute force those cookies as well. And then stealing cookies, where I've got an actual cookie from a user. I can present that to the web server and say, look, I'm user A. Don't worry about the fact that I'm now coming from a different IP address. A lot of web applications don't check for that. But now that I'm coming from a different IP address, as long as I have this cookie with this session ID in it, I'm that user. There are several different counters to this that you can use, countermeasures. Making sure that your session ID is large so that it can't be brute forced. Making sure that sessions are only good for 5 or 10 minutes. If you log into your online banking site and you don't do anything for 5 minutes, what happens? The site will either log you off, or you'll get a pop-up that says, are you still there? And you can click yes or no to keep your session alive and keep going. But every couple minutes after that, it's going to ask you, are you still here? What they're trying to do with that is make sure that the session has a valid user assigned to it and that you're still using the site. If not, they're just going to kill the session. That way, even if an attacker compromises your session ID or your cookie, they can't use it because the session's dead and the server's going to ignore anything related to that session ID. Ensuring session IDs are unpredictable. There's a whole slate of attacks in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, around websites who had very easy-to-guess session IDs. And they were incremental. So if the first person to log in the site got session ID 001, I'll give you one guess as to what the session ID of the next user to log in would be. 002. The next guy would get 003. What that allows is attackers to guess what the next session ID is, and once a user logs in with that, they can grab that session ID because they know what's coming, and they can present that to the server and hijack the session that way. Encrypting cookies and making sure that they're only sent over secure connections will prevent somebody from doing a man-in-the-middle attack and compromising your session cookies that way. Implementing a logout button, this will effectively kill that session. So again, even if it does get compromised, doesn't matter. That session's gone. The web server's just going to ignore it after that. And the last one there is kind of an interesting one. You see this now more and more with websites who are doing fingerprinting of clients. And so they're looking at the browser strings, they're looking at the user agents that are there, they're looking at your IP address, they're looking for presence of cookies. Some sites even go as far as to look at how quickly or slowly you type in your password. And through all of that data, they can determine, is this the same user or not? Very interesting, novel ways of doing that. But essentially what it does is you're linking a session ID with some type of properties related to that client. And by binding that, then you know that, okay, this guy really is Chris, and he's accessing his online banking account. Man-in-the-middle attacks, not as common as they used to be. It's somewhat difficult to pull these off unless you're actually sitting somewhere along this path between the web server and the victim. But as the victim and the web server are setting up their communication, some type of data is going to come from the web server back to the client. It's going to be a session ID, it's going to be a cookie, it's going to be something that is going to allow the web server to identify the victim going forward. And what attackers can do is they can sniff that data request, that response, that cookie, that session ID, and then actually play it back to the web server and say, you know, the victim over here has this session ID, but I am this victim now. I am the victim. And I'm replaying that session ID back to the web server and essentially taking over the user's session. A couple examples here. Many years ago, there was a really famous demonstration at DEF CON where people were hijacking Gmail accounts. There's an absolutely fascinating story about this. If you have a chance, go out, Google it, take a look at it. The guys behind this did it all up front. I mean, there was nothing, sneaky or anything about it. They weren't. They were trying to demonstrate the vulnerability, not actually compromise usernames and passwords for malicious purposes. But they were able to capture these sessions between Gmail users. So as users on the DEF CON network trying to log into Gmail, which is always a bad idea, but there are people who do that every year anyway, they were actually modifying or intercepting the cookies that Gmail was associated with individual sessions. So they were able to intercept it, unencrypt the transaction, get the session ID, and then they were able to replay that session ID back to Gmail and access people's email account or whatever Google service it was that they were trying to log in to. And now you'll see that when you go to Gmail, it's always HTTPS, www.gmail.com. So Google has since fixed this issue. It didn't take them long to do that, but that's now why you see when you go to Gmail, it's all HTTPS encrypted. Another example of session hijacking, Firesheep. So this was an extension of the work that was done at DEF CON. This was an attempt to make it accessible to the masses, and this shows just how click, point, hack, this sort of stuff has become. There was a Firefox add-on called Firesheep that allowed you to hijack sessions. So just a browser add-on is now monitoring for various sessions that are getting created, looking for various sites like Twitter, Google, Facebook, Twitter, or Flickr, and those sorts of sites. And it's able to see sessions that are being initiated and compromising either the cookies or the IDs behind that. And it gives you a nice little graphical way to say, oh, Chris is logging into his Gmail account. Yep, break into that. We'll take over that session. The answer to this, of course, is all of these attacks are enabled by people sitting on the same network or the same Wi-Fi network and being able to sniff that traffic. So if you use a VPN, then that traffic can't be sniffed. It can't be intercepted. And so the simple answer to this is when you're on a public wireless network, just use a VPN to protect all of your communication with Google or Facebook or something like that. And then even if somebody is sitting there listening to the middle of the conversation, they can't actually get into the session and hijack you.